In this lecture, we're going to talk about learning activities and visual aids, which will include criteria for making a good PowerPoint and poster.
So, education is based on the instructional sequence, where you have your overall goals, your objectives, and those will be discussed in another lecture. But we're going to focus today on learning activities, how we're actually getting information to our student.
So learning activities should be selected based on the goals and objectives because you want to choose a learning activity that will best suit mastery of your objectives. And activities include the lecture, a flipped classroom, case studies, simulations and role playing, cooperative learning, problem-based learning, IPE, online tutorials, simulated or student laboratory, as well as demonstrations. And we'll talk about each one of these individually. So the lecture is what we're most familiar with as students and instructors because it has several advantages, including the ability to transmit a lot of information at one time. So it's just really good about teaching all the things very quickly. The instructor can demonstrate enthusiasm. It's easy to update it. You just update your slides, and it doesn't require learner participation. I'm not really sure that's an advantage, but we'll go with it. And disadvantages is that the learner is passive because it doesn't require learner participation. And it also isn't great at having the material that's presented be retained. So it kind of goes in the ear and out the other, in one ear and out the other. But it is good at transmitting a lot of information. And if you give them a handout of the lecture slides, students can study from it. So it has some advantages, which is why it's used a lot. So one way to increase learner participation, which has been shown to increase retention of the material, is the instructor can ask questions. These questions should facilitate engagement and active learning. By asking questions, you involve the learner. It also helps provide feedback to the instructor and provides reinforcement and review of the material. And the instructor should ask questions at various cognitive levels. So these questions should not be just simple yes or no answer type questions. They should be like, why? How? And they can be designed to promote analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, which can help with some of your higher cognitive level objectives. And it's important to ask the questions in a non-threatening and informal manner so the students aren't too intimidated to answer. You can also use audience response systems such as like texting in answers that will have like a live feed or like clickers, things like that. Soliciting feedback, being like, hey, do you understand what's going on? Do you want me to clarify this more? And then having assigned discussion topics so that whatever you covered in lecture can then be discussed in more detail so it's retained better. So in general, a lecture is organized in the following manner. It has an introduction, and the purpose of the introduction is to arouse curiosity. It should show the learner what's going to be presented, and that material is both important and relevant. And one way to do this is to begin the lecture with a case study or problem that can be answered or solved by the lecture material. And the introduction should relate the present lecture material to the past lectures, because this enhances learning when the new material is associated with previously acquired information. And a lot of instructors will summarize the previous lecture at the beginning of the new lecture. The body of the lecture should facilitate the retention and application of information. It should promote problem solving. And then repetition is nice because it helps emphasize key points and promote retention of the information. It's also been shown that learners retain images longer than words. So if, when possible, include pictures, and this shouldn't just be crappy clip art pictures, but relevant pictures. You don't want to add a picture just for the sake of having a picture. And you can also use relevant examples to enforce the importance of material and encourage learners to apply the information to new situations. And it's also important that learners have a variety of activities to maintain their interest. So having embedded videos can be an effective visual aid. And then the last part of the lecture is the conclusion, where the instructor summarizes the key points, draws the lecture to a close, and describes future lecture plans. And in general, the best practice is to end lecture a few minutes early so that people can ask questions and ponder what you've taught. And no one likes it when people run the lecture long because they're like, I got places to be. Why am I still here? So when in doubt, end early. So delivery of the lecture. So one thing to do is to demonstrate enthusiasm by movement, varying voice pitch, because no one likes to hear a lecture that's delivered like this. Avoid reading the lecture notes to the class. Establish appropriate pace. No one likes hearing that. So when you're talking, you should sound enthusiastic. You should have hand gestures. You can move around the room a little bit, but you want to avoid pacing because then that's just a visual distraction. And so you want to avoid reading the lecture notes to the class, which is kind of what I'm doing right now, so sorry. Establish an appropriate pace. This is particularly important if you have a lot of students that are new to the material or maybe English isn't their first language. I know I have a tendency to talk quickly, and that has been problematic in the past. So you want to make sure you keep a good pace where it's easy to follow. It's not rushed, but it's also not, why is this person going so slow? And you want to talk to the learner rather than at them, because the learners want to feel like, that you're talking to them. It's more interesting for them because they're like, why am I here if they're not even talking to me? And then you want to minimize nervous habits in speech and gestures like saying, okay, things like that. And then maintain eye contact with audience. Obviously, this is super easy to do with an online delivery lecture format, but in general, if you're lecturing in person, you should maintain eye contact with the audience and not just stare at your screen the entire time. So that was the lecture. Now we're going to talk about the flipped classroom. Some of you might have heard about the flipped classroom, but in the flipped classroom, the new material or what's usually given in like the lecture is presented prior to the class. So this can be through like video lectures like what we're doing right now, videos that you've assigned for them to read. Those can be like YouTube videos or instructional videos, reading assignments. And it's important that there's some sort of accountability to make sure that the students actually do the assignments prior to class so that they know what they're doing when they come into class. So that can be quizzes or worksheets or some other assignments, and those should contribute to the final grade, because if it's not graded, students aren't really super motivated to do it. So the class time in the flipped classroom, instead of being used to learn new material, is being used to develop higher cognitive skills. So this can be using case studies. I know some of your professors, they will utilize class time to do case studies. They can be used small group discussions, problem solving activities. So like in your management class to solve managing problems. So it's a great way to promote higher cognitive skill development rather than just learning the material. All right, so a case study, which can be a part of a flipped classroom, but can also be a standalone thing. It can be used to address higher cognitive domains or taxonomies. So it helps promote problem solving skills because you have to look at the case, figure out what's going on with it, that kind of thing. And it can be a useful introduction or summary for a lecture. And a case study is designed to illustrate disease states or problems in the clinical laboratory, such as like instrument malfunctions, quality assurance problems, or management situations. It's nice to use the objectives, and it uses objectives that emphasize knowledge and skills and attitudes, and rather than just focusing on can they get the right diagnosis, because that's more cognitive, a lower cognitive level. So you want to you can use case studies to hit domains and taxonomies that are kind of harder to hit with just a lecture. So sources of case studies include professional journals, actual problems that have been seen in the lab, and then you can also get case studies from professional organizations and associations. And the instructor may modify the material in the case study to emphasize relevant points or delete material that is not relevant and might just be confusing to the learners. I know when I'm designing case studies, I kind of make it a textbook case study, so it doesn't have a lot of distracting information. I want them to be able to see this is a textbook case. Can they diagnose it? That kind of thing. Whereas in other situations like management, where you're trying to go for a more problem-based situation, you might throw in some craziness or distractors, because that's what happens in the real world. So you can make it like a textbook, or you can make it more real life. It's up to you and what you're trying to accomplish with your case study. So another learning activity is simulations and role playing. And these provide a risk-free environment for promoting problem solving skills and improving communication techniques. These are usually, you do it with a group of people. So in a simulation is different from a role playing. In a simulation, you are yourself. You are still you, and you have been given a simulation. You've been given a situation that you're working through, but you're still you. So that hasn't changed. So you're still acting how you would act. So this can be written online or in person. It's more fun if it's in person because then you get to respond in real time to things. Role playing, on the other hand, you're assigned a role. So you could be assigned to assume you're the manager, or assume you're the employee or a coworker, or things like that. So you're assuming a role that you might not necessarily already have to address the problem. And a few learners participate while others observe. And then you can have like a discussion period afterwards, so the audience can chime in being like, oh, I would have done this, or that was great, but that wasn't, that kind of thing. So the uses of simulations and role playing is that they're very good for mastery of effective and higher cognitive domains because they promote problem solving. And in these, the instructor provides the scenarios, and then you also provide class time for discussion. And these are most effective when they represent a situation that the learner will be likely to encounter, like your friend, you testing a friend's lab results and they have AIDS. Do you tell their boyfriend? That kind of thing. So you want to make it relevant. And the problem with these is that they can be time consuming to develop and implement because you have to use, it takes quite a bit of time to make these. So that's a con, but the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, especially once you've invested the time in making it, because you can just use it the next year. All right, so an example of a role-playing scenario. You observe a CLS recording results for quality control that you know she did not perform. As her coworker, what will you do? You'd be like, yo, hey, don't do that. That's not good. Why don't you just do it? It's not worth your job. And then as her supervisor, what will you do? Hey, you're not allowed to do that. You get one warning, otherwise I'll fire you. So that kind of thing. So you would some people in the group would be assigned different roles, and then an audience would observe the people acting out the roles. And some would be assigned to maybe to be like the person not recording, not doing the QC. All right, our next learning activity is the cooperative learning. So it's useful for effective and higher cognitive domain objectives. It helps develop problem-solving skills. It increases communication skills because you're working with a group. And it also focuses on group skills because you're in a group. And in this, the learner takes responsibility for the learning. So the learner has some prior knowledge of the topic, but they need to acquire more knowledge, and it's their responsibility to find that new knowledge, and it helps promote group work. So in cooperative learning, the learner assumes the role of both the instructor and the learner. So they use knowledge that they've previously acquired in the curriculum, and the learner independently supplements it with additional information and then shares that new knowledge with the group, thereby teaching his or her peers. And anytime you're teaching something, you yourself, the teacher, learn it better. So this can be done by oral and written presentations and by the groups. Then we have problem-based learning. This is similar to cooperative learning, but the important thing is that the learner doesn't have any prior knowledge of the topic. So you're just going in blind. So the problem with problem-based learning is that it doesn't cover a lot of content material, but it does teach critical skills such as communicating effectively with colleagues, functioning effectively in a group, and learning to problem solve. And learning to problem solve is so important in the clinical lab. So in problem-based learning, the learners are working in small groups and they're presented with a problem to solve, and they don't have any prior knowledge on how to solve this. So the group has to gather information. They have to find the right learning resources to find the information. So you have to figure out how to solve problems. And that's what happens in the real world. And the instructor isn't helping you figure out the problem. They're just facilitating. Like if you have a question, they might provide a little bit of help and nudge you in the right direction, but they're not the one doing the problem solving. They're just kind of watching, observing, helping when needed. And then this is extremely important for developing skills for clinical laboratory science practice because you're going to encounter problems in the real world. So some examples of problem-based learning are case studies, clinical correlation questions, QC problems, or instrumentation troubleshooting. And this is extremely similar as much as possible to what you see in real life. So it's extremely wonderful if an instructor can get this into their class. All right, so the next learning activity is interprofessional education, or IPE for short. And this is collaborative learning amongst varied healthcare professionals to improve patient outcomes. This is very similar to cooperative learning, but it's not just CLS people, it's a bunch of different healthcare professionals. So you could have nursing staff, you could have doctors, you could have occupational therapists, respiratory therapists. Basically, the entire health team will come together and try to solve problems to improve patient outcomes. So this is really helpful because it promotes communication between the professions, it promotes teamwork in the professions, consensus building, respect, which I feel like is so important in the clinical laboratory science field because a lot of times people just kind of forget about us because we're in the basement and they don't think about where the lab results come from or the fact that people are actually running the tests. So it's super amazing to do IPE when possible with other health professionals because it just really allows people to see what the other health professionals do. Like, do you know the role of a nurse on a health team? Do you know the role of physical therapy? It really gives everyone a respect for what each person brings to the team. All right, our next learning activity is online tutorials. So these are sources of individual instruction because you'll do them by yourself online. These are learner-paced. A lot of times they're in small self-contained units. So instead of being like a 2-hour video, they're shortened up into 15, 20-minute videos, that type of things. And it's best used when there's visual images because, as I mentioned previously, people remember pictures better than words. And you can use it to cover all levels of cognitive and affective domains. And you can promote user engagement by having interactive sequences, by having like quiz questions or other things included in the tutorials that keep them engaged. And it's very useful for continuing education delivery because a association can make a continuing education topic and post it online. You pay a fee and you can do their continuing education class. So you get your CE credits in for your CLS renewal, certification renewal. Compared to the lecture format, the learners are more active in this because they're often required to respond frequently and are given immediate feedback on that response. So you can have like embedded quiz questions that have feedback on, oh no, that wasn't right because of this. And then the online instruction is most effective when the instructor is closely monitoring the learner's progress and aids the learner in the application of the knowledge gained. So in a perfect world, you just don't have these online thing set up and the instructor just sets it up and never looks at it again. It's best if the instructor is making sure that the learners are progressing through appropriately. All right, and then our next learning activity is a simulated or student laboratory. So that's what you did all last year. So this is wonderful because it integrates the psychomotor and cognitive domains. All the things we've talked about prior to this have been very affective or cognitive domain focused. This is where we start to get into the psychomotor domains because you get to actually acquire and practice skills in a non-threatening environment. Some of you may disagree that student lab is not non-threatening, but it should be non-threatening because no one's lives are actually at stake. And it's an opportunity for individualized instruction and feedback because the instructors are walking around, seeing what the students are doing, giving real-time feedback as much as possible. So some limitations of the student laboratory, they can be time-consuming for the faculty to set up and costly in terms of reagents and equipment. For this reason, some student laboratory experiences have been created using virtual microscopy and procedures for hematology and microbiology and body fluids. For body fluids, it's actually quite nice because a lot of times the instructors don't have access to some of the body fluids. One disadvantage is that if they're not run appropriately or planned appropriately, they can kind of turn into cookbook exercises where you're just like, okay, pipette this, add that, measure its spectrophotometry. It just kind of is cookie cutter. It's not really engaging in terms of cognitive domains and psychomotors, so it kind of keeps you at lower levels. So it needs to be developed well. So some ways to do this is to develop a manual, and in that manual you can have higher learning questions to help the students think more deeply about something. It helps facilitate, you can help facilitate the progression of the student skills by observation. You definitely need to pre-run the labs to make sure they're working. And then the instructor also needs to integrate and emphasize application and problem-solving skills. So that's where things like lab reports and study questions come into play, or setting up labs in such a way that you're trying to solve a problem. So there are ways to definitely improve student lab and get more out of it. And then one of our last learning activities is demonstrations. So in demonstrations, an instructor or even a learner performs a demonstration of a skill. So the benefit of these is that it allows many learners to see a skill in practice. This is particularly helpful if the materials needed are in short supply or are very expensive and you don't have enough funding or time to have everyone do it themselves. So you do a demonstration of it. It's also good if they're going to be doing it, themselves and they want to see it done firsthand before they attempt it. The problem with demonstrations is it doesn't always allow every learner to participate. So depending on how you set things up, you might only get 1 or 2 learners that are doing it and everyone else is just watching. So pros and cons. So some instructional resources, course management systems like Canvas, can be useful for setting up online instruction, discussion groups, videos. We're doing it for lecture right now. It's important to have a course syllabus so students know the expectations of them. Textbooks, handouts, and then online materials as well can all be used as instructional resources to enhance your learning activities and mastery of the objectives. So the course syllabus, there are some things that are required. The universities have templates that are available and that they have required components of a syllabus. So definitely the course name, number, meeting time, and location, so you know what class you're taking and where you need to be. The instructor's name, office hours, and contact information. The course goals and objectives, and depending on the instructor, these may be extremely vague or non-existent. Or they could be extremely detailed. The schedule of topics. Some of this might actually be on Canvas or your learning system. Reading assignments, exam schedule, honor code policy, and then universities usually have some additional material that they require, such as things on like disability accommodations, things like that. And then textbooks, you can have a traditional textbook or a digital textbook. That depends on the publisher and the preferences of the instructor. Some instructors may require that they have a traditional textbook because you're going to be bringing it into the lab, and you don't have access to iPads at all universities. Others might want the digital textbook because there are iPads in the lab. They don't want you bringing a paper textbook in and out. You can also have course packets where the instructor gathers reading material from all different types of sources and packages it all together that can be sold by the bookstore as course packets, or can be put on the learning management system if it doesn't need to be printed. Handouts are great for organizing and for the students for note-taking. You can use it to cut and paste complex drawings, especially if you're doing a lecture and that drawing would be difficult to see on the slide. You always want to make sure you credit the source. You want to do plagiarism. But the important thing with handouts is you don't want to make like a verbatim transcript, because then the person's just going to read the handout and not pay attention to the instructor. Because what's the point of paying attention to the instructor? Everything's already written down for you. So, and then you're not getting the benefit of note-taking, because note-taking helps facilitate engagement and retention of information. And if it's a transcript, there's no point in taking notes because everything's already there. Okay, so now we're going to talk about best practices for your presentation slides, which will be relevant for your continuing education project. So I will warn you, this slide does not follow best practices. So please forgive me. I tried to make it better by adding little bullet points that magically appear. All right, so the first thing is that you want to ensure the learning objectives are covered. So one of the things that I do is I have my learning objectives and I just have a blank presentation and I copy and paste each learning objective onto a slide, usually in the notes section, and then I go through and fill in the slide. So I'm like, okay, this is the objective, this is the learning objective, okay, now I need a slide for that, and make sure that each learning objective is covered. Then you want high contrast between the font and the background. So usually this is like a black font on a white background. This is good if you're going to have dim lighting, or you can have a black background with a white font, which is good if you're going to be in a room that has that's going to be well lit, because that enhances the contrast. Then you want the font to be big enough to see from the back of the room. So this has a lot to do with the size of the room as well. You also want to avoid serif fonts. A serif font is the fonts that have the little squiggles. So this is Times New Roman. You see it has like these little tick marks at the S and stuff. Those are serifs. So you want to use a sans serif font. So the other font on this slide is a sans serif font. It doesn't have those extra lines on the letters because it just makes it easier to read, especially from a distance. Then you want to limit the text on the slide and elaborate verbally. So number one, the listeners have to listen to you. The learners have to listen to you. And number two, if the slide has a lot of information on it, your eyes are just darting all over and it's really hard to figure out where to look. And it's distracting. I posted a YouTube video about how to make good presentations, so feel free to check those out. One of them is based on like for scientific presentations, and I think I posted one that was good for kind of rethinking how to make PowerPoint slides, which I thought was interesting. It was like from a TED Talk. And then you want to include images that add to the content. You always want to cite your source. And then a general rule of thumb when you're trying to figure out, okay, how many slides do I need versus how much time do I have to give this presentation? A general rule of thumb is that 1 minute per slide is about right. So if I have 50 slides, that's going to take me about 50 minutes to give. And then can you plan in any sort of audience interaction, because that facilitates engagement and retention. All right, now we're going to talk about research posters. If you go into grad school or you ever want to present at a meeting in the future, like a clinical laboratory education conference, that kind of thing, you might be presenting a poster, and I'm going to teach you how to do it. So the purpose is to present the work to an audience who is walking through a hallway or an exhibit. So you want it to be eye-catching and you want it to be easy to understand. So generally you kind of think of a research poster as like a visual abstract. So at a conference, the presenter stands next to the poster, and then anyone who stops at their poster, they can engage them in conversation, have a one-on-one discussion with anyone who passes by. If you've ever done a poster session, you know that a lot of people don't stop, and it's kind of disheartening. So you can also just have your research poster up in a hallway, and then you're not going to have someone standing next to it. So these are standalone presentations for people passing by to look at. So you see this a lot in buildings that have research labs. They'll have their most recent posters up in the hallway, and people will stop and look and be like, oh, okay, that's cool. So those need to be kind of standalone, like no one's going to be describing it for them. So a research poster, in terms of what content is on there, it has a title, and the title should quickly orient the audience. You may or may not have the abstract on there. The abstract generally takes up a lot of space. It's a lot of words. The poster itself is supposed to be like a visual abstract, so depending on the poster, you may or may not have that on there. You should have an introduction to orient the audience as to what the poster is about and why it's important. Methods, this will be extremely brief because you don't want to use up a lot of poster space on methods. So this will not be into the same detail that the methods section is in a journal article. The results, So this will have your figures and your figure descriptions, your conclusions, and you'll have like acknowledgments and maybe some references on there, and like funding sources and things like that. And it's also extremely helpful to put up a QR code on your poster, because then say someone doesn't have time to sit and stop at your poster, but they were interested in it, they can scan the QR code and it will take them to a website that has, say, the journal article that the poster is based on, or a copy of that, like a PDF of the poster, so they can review it at a later date. Or you can have a QR code that links to your contact information, that kind of thing. So it's kind of up to you what you want the QR to go towards, like to link to, but QR codes are a very nice way to give people access to the more information if they want it. So aspects to a good poster: you want the title to quickly orient the audience. So sometimes this is what the question is, sometimes this is what the conclusions are. You want to very quickly orient the audience to the purpose of the research. So why should they continue looking at your poster? And then you want to have the specific sections to be easy to locate, and you want them to be easy to read. So you want to avoid tiny fonts, you want to avoid lots of words, you want it to be as visual as possible. So I have down here some links. thecraftofthescientificposters.com has some great tips on how to do traditional posters. And then there's this great YouTube video on kind of non-traditional science posters, because the traditional posters are not as eye-catching as they could be. So this YouTube video, I highly recommend watching it. It kind of shows you how to redesign posters so that they quickly grab people's attention and just show your main points quickly and effectively. It's a really good video. Please watch it. So I'm going to show you some example of some traditional science posters. This is one that I got from thecraftofscientificposters.com about particles in micro-discharge plasma. I have no idea what any of that is. They're making something with slides and metal, I think. But you can see that they have their background, their objectives. They got some nice images, so I kind of know what's going on, even though I have no idea what any of this topic is. And their results and some acknowledgments. So simple, lots of white space, not a whole bunch of words, lots of figures. It's very nice. And you'll often see like a logo for whoever the university is or company is. And now I'll show you another poster. So this is my poster because I can do that when I'm the instructor. So this one has an abstract on there, and you can see, you know, there's a lot of words, and you're kind of like, oh, big block of words, ignore, ignore. That's fine. And you have your university logo. The title is a statement. So iron is an important mediator for the anti-cancer activity of LDL-DHA nanoparticles. So we're basically saying iron is cool at killing cancer. Yay. It's another logo. And then I have some figures, some pretty images, fluorescent images, figure descriptions. This one's actually kind of a busy poster. It's maybe not the best example, but it's mine, so I'm showing it to you. And acknowledgments and references. But you see this is a visual summary of the project. So a lot of times with posters is people want to put all the information on there. They want all the things, and it's kind of hard to edit it back because you want to include everything. So this is where QR codes are super awesome, because you could have just been like, okay, for more information, scan this code, that kind of thing. So there's many ways to do this. This is a traditional poster, but I highly recommend watching that YouTube video on non-traditional posters. And now a lot of conferences are moving to digital posters. So instead of printing out a poster, spending $100, having to travel with it, only to post it in a hallway or throw it away, they're now doing large TV screens, and you have a digital poster, and people can, like, it's usually like a touch screen or a computer, and they can go to different posters from the same screen and see more information. So I didn't cover how to do digital posters, but that is something to be aware of. All right, so the summary for this lecture is that there's many different types of learning activities, and it's important to choose your learning activity based on your learning objectives so that you can best promote mastery of those learning objectives. And it's also important to note that you may need more than one type of learning activity for your instructional unit to make sure that all the learning objectives are mastered. So there's a lot of times where you have especially in CLS program, you have lab and lecture. So you get everything.